Miguel Delaney, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning, not too bad.
What's Lisbon like at the moment? It seems as if restaurants are open, are bars open. Is there like a little bit of life around the place?
A little bit. A lot of Spanish tourists, from what I can tell, but still very quiet. And just so much space everywhere, which is not what you'd associate with a city like this at this time of year. And it is a little bit poignant in the sense that, down in the main square, just down from Libertad, they have that giant inflatable Champions League that they always put up, or the trophy itself, a giant inflatable trophy that they always put up anytime they're staging a final somewhere. And obviously, usually there'll be, thousands of people around it. Yeah, you walk down there now, and it's usually a scattered kind of 20 people or whatever, which kind of just, I suppose, emphasizes the oddity of this occasion.
I half expected some Munich fans to get in their cars and to drive this week and to be in Lisbon just for the weather's good. It's a nice place to spend some time. Has that happened at all? Has there been any sign of that?
Yeah, there's a few in my hotel actually, because I saw a few Bayern Munich jerseys, a few scattered around, but it's not exactly. I remember being, I think this is this is the third final I've done, or fourth, involving Bayern Munich. I remember especially in 2010 in Madrid, the place was absolutely packed with Munich fans. But at best, you're kind of I've seen about 15, 20 around here. But yeah, so there's a little bit, but it's almost kind of maybe for showing their face for representation and not much else.
Miguel, we'll talk about the football itself in a couple of minutes' time. I have seen a debate from various people asking what the difference between what's going on with Paris Saint-Germain is from, say, Juventus when the Agnelli family bought it, or Philips and PSV Eindhoven, or Bayer and Bayer Leverkusen. None of these are, they're to varying degrees, they're all an effort to use football for either profit or to make a drug company look cool, or to give the workers something to do and maybe get involved in football. And there's kind of Silvio Berlusconi is another example. What do you say to people who do ask that question about what is the fundamental difference between a state being involved, and in Berlusconi's case it was the opportunity for him to take over football and football on TV and then use that as a springboard to become the Prime Minister of a country?
Well, I think it's much more directly cynical, and it's basically almost top-down exploitation of the sport rather than kind of bottom-up exploitation. And that's what it really comes down to. You pointed to a few clubs there, like, say, Juventus with Fiat or Bayer Leverkusen. In pretty much all those cases, though, the club itself grew out of essentially the workers wanting to play and representing a group of people. And then through that, even in Berlusconi's case, I think one of the theory of Berlusconi is, through the adulation he got with football, that almost kind of fired his imagination for politics. And even then, I suppose one of the problems with PSG but why this is also a landmark is this is an evolution of the way football was going. And the game, written about this a lot in Independent, but the game's greedy embrace of hypercapitalism led it to grow to a size where certain clubs were attractive to wider interest than just making money or the promotion of certain companies or whatever. But even in the case of, say, Agnelli, it's still ultimately about the club. Same with Berlusconi with Milan. It's ultimately about, there are obviously ulterior objectives, but they run parallel to what the club is. And the fundamental is about the success of the football club. With Paris Saint-Germain, that's not the case. The football club is ultimately, the success of the football club is only important insofar as the promotion, or I'm not even sure what word to correctly use when it comes down to it, but it's about the enhancement of Qatar's image and something a lot deeper and a lot more sophisticated. And when you get right down to it then, and where it really goes into issues beyond football, financial disparity, greed in football, obviously bad things, but that still very much pales next to real world concerns like migrant worker deaths, like human rights abuses. And the most simplistic but still fair criticism of Qatar in that sense, that this is all a sports washing project designed to deflect, or really not designed to deflect, because I think this is something that's come up a lot with the World Cup, where they won the World Cup for 2022, and it's just it's brought more criticism than I ever had about migrant workers. But almost the key with these situations, and we've particularly seen this with Abu Dhabi and Man City, is that it allows them to go having projects like this and something that allows this level of integration into the West, basically essentially allows them to go about business or even do better business despite a myriad of problems that should really warrant great scrutiny. And now that they're in the final, they should warrant greater scrutiny than ever. But that's also why I think it is a landmark day of football. Football has obviously going this way, but now that it's here, it is worth reflecting on the situation we're in and how bad it's got.
Yeah.
That what is essentially a political project is in the Champions League final.
I'm always conflicted about this because I think that, like, the easy answer to the point I'm about to make is that by not playing with South Africa, it really helped. By ostracising South Africa, it helped to speed the process along. And yet the counter argument is that by these clubs being owned by these countries, suddenly actually people are more interested in them than they would be otherwise. Like, how does change come about in the future unless it comes from the scrutiny that you bring in your pieces, where you're writing a match report and it's like, hang on a second here, everything else that's happening around this club is actually far more important and more interesting than is happening on the football pitch. In a way, it's slightly counterintuitive, but by allowing them to get involved in the first place, there might be a potential positive outcome down the line from the scrutiny that comes. Is there any merit in that argument?
It's one. I did a piece on this 2 months ago, and discussed exactly this with Peter Hain, who was, of course, central to kind of the boycott moment or the boycott movement as regards to African sport. I think you're right to a degree. Like, when City won the treble last year, and myself and other journalists suddenly, because of the extent of the domination, we asked what exactly. Like, it poses a greater question. And suddenly, hang on a second, we've got to look at this, and like we basically heard that the club, or maybe kind of some of the Abu Dhabi owners, weren't exactly happy with references to the war in Yemen in match reports. That wasn't the goal. But ultimately, a bit of criticism from kind of left-leaning journalists or some academics really pales next to the success they get. And if you look at the City case, right, I think the South African argument still stands in that. You basically, I think the Hain approach is ultimately completely right. Because if you look at the City case, the argument is that, well, by integrating them, it might improve conditions, improve attitude to human rights. With Manchester City and Abu Dhabi, the absolute opposite has happened. I mean, if you talk to any academic who's working in the area, I've spoken to kind of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty on this, Abu Dhabi is in a much, much worse place as regards human rights in 2020 than it was in 2008. And despite that, obviously, we've seen the massive growth of the City project. We've seen Abu Dhabi use the club to basically launch a construction empire in Manchester. At the same time, when Khaldoon, who is the chairman of Manchester City and also the de facto prime minister of Abu Dhabi, anytime he's over in England on club business, he also uses these trips to meet with basically government officials in meetings that you only really read about in the Abu Dhabi press if you go looking. So from that perspective, I mean, ultimately, I think the best way to put it is, if you just allow them into the sport without any questions asked, or without any attempt at reform, it means they can just go about business anyway. That they get all these massive benefits without having to change. I think that's precisely what's happened, and it's why we should be pushing back against this, and now asking the biggest questions. And the biggest one with Qatar this weekend, as they have the game that has been seen as a culmination of a grand project, is how many migrant workers have died since 2012? It's a question the country still won't answer. Yeah, and a question that is obviously intimately connected to sport, given how much construction has been involved with the 2022 World Cup.
Yeah, they are slightly separate scenarios, but ultimately they have essentially the same aim of establishing a power base in a part of the world where you then are involved in new types of businesses, and you have soft power, soft diplomatic power, and access to all sorts of global stars, and as Adam
Kugel from Human Rights Watch put it to me, one of the kind of easiest ways to sum it up is basically, if you have a football club and suddenly you're connected to all different sectors of society, it fosters the image of, hey, these are good guys to do business with. And I mean, that's almost the simplest way of putting it. And so on one side, you obviously have all these human rights concerns, complaints from kind of, Amnesty and human rights groups. But then on the other side, well, look at this great football. Hey, these guys are okay. And it is as crude as that almost.
And it turns out that the football is so great. Like, that the constellation of stars Paris Saint-Germain have put together is actually quite intoxicating sometimes.
Yeah, that's the shameful seduction of it. And I think it's almost a little bit of a metaphor for the Champions League itself, because I think the Champions League has become a massively problematic competition because the amount of money in it and the amount of prize money has basically created this huge financial disparity in Europe, to the point that it's actually eroding football's unpredictability. And we see, like, the two finalists this weekend, Bayern and Paris Saint-Germain, there's not really a realistic chance of anyone winning their domestic leagues anytime soon ever again. And the Champions League has been a huge factor in that. We should have a massive problem with this competition. But the flip side is, because there's so much money in it, the football is so good when these big teams meet, and thereby it's so seductive, and we'll all be looking on kind of, enraptured on Sunday.
Well, we were having this conversation a little bit earlier on, is like, once the game kicks off, can you actually remember that this is a nation state financed the way they are in one side? And I mean, I don't really have that much problem with the history of Bayern, apart from their various scandals along the way. Like, it's impossible not to be seduced. It's impossible to remember the whole way through for the 97, 98 minutes, because you love the game.
Yeah. And then, of course, even say if you're writing on it or reporting on it, it is actually, it almost feels incongruous. So on one side, you're talking about the glory of these players and, the history of a competition like this and what it means, and then crowbar in references to actually the greater significance. But I actually think it's necessary now. We should be, if we're in football media or sporting media, and I suppose one of the concerns of media should be the kind of the betterment of society and the sport. We should be including these references with everything. Basically, we should be making what a club like Paris Saint-Germain is front and center, because otherwise the argument is that you're engaging in sports washing, and that you become both a victim of it and someone who propels it.
Yeah, which is the worst part. You're just a patsy at that point.
Yeah.
That's not great.
Miguel, just on sports washing, I mean, is part of the problem that maybe fans don't really care? That I think you wrote a couple of months ago in The Independent about, you quoted a Newcastle fan saying, if I get to celebrate our first trophy in decades along with my son, I won't care who's in charge of us. That these tycoons maybe pounce on the fact that, fans really don't care. And the sentiment is there that even among PSG fans this weekend that, we're in the Champions League final. We don't care how we got there.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly, and it's not even the fans don't care, because I'm talking to a lot of fans. I mean, and even if you talk to Man City fans today, there is always that kind of, for a lot of them, it's there hanging. But I suppose, I remember speaking to someone about it, and if you look at it from a psychological perspective, it can often be unfair to ask the most severe questions of fans, like boycott their club or whatever, because ultimately, this is something they grew up with. They've formed kind of a really strong psychological. I mean, if you want to connect it to kind of how people think about GA counties, whatever, but something they've grown up with, they formed a really strong psychological connection with that precedes owners like this. And it's very difficult to kind of make any sort of detachment, which means a lot of people have to kind of make almost moral compromises with it if they do indeed care. But it's because of that emotional power of sport that these owners are directly trying to tap into. And I remember being told in the midst of the attempted Saudi takeover of Newcastle that it was precisely Newcastle's struggles over the past 30 years or longer in terms of actually being successful, and particularly with Mike Ashley, in that the club kind of almost felt it was moribund really under Mike Ashley, that this was ripe for a takeover, because it meant anyone coming in as owner was going to be welcomed, particularly anyone that was promising a lot of money. And Paris Saint-Germain are also an interesting club in that regard, in that, I mean, they're quite a new, it's wrong to say they have no history, but they're a relatively new club. They're only founded in 1972 as an amalgamation of different French clubs. And through the kind of 4 decades until they were bought by Qatar, they went through very different incarnations, from a club that was regularly beset by crisis to in the 90s when they were bought out by, the model that distorted the game then, which is the Berlusconi broadcasting model, although in this case, Canal Plus, who bought PSG and, create that team with Ginola, Rai, and most famously, George Weah. But, just before Qatar had bought them, they'd gone through a decade of crisis. And because of that, a club with that kind of, I suppose, variable identity is much more malleable for a project like this, where now I mean, I wrote a piece today about France's history of the Champions League, and they've only got one Champions League, and that should have an asterisk beside it because it was Marseille when, you know, they were found guilty of match fixing and relegated for a league game just before that. Well, the irony is, if the French league does finally get its Champions League again this weekend, it's really more Qatar's Champions League than France's.
I guess.
Sorry, go on. No, go on. Go for it.
I suppose we should talk about football as well, given that the match takes place on Sunday. But John Giles was on last night and had a bit of a turnabout on Neymar. He's coming around to Neymar's attitude. And I know, Miguel, this is something you've spoken about recently as well, that we all remember him sitting in the stands when PSG lost to Manchester United last year, a disconsolate figure. But how has his mindset and focus changed to help get PSG to this final on Sunday?
Well, it feels like the kind of pennies dropped for him a little bit. And to be fair, actually, what the club were in terms of the football project, I would say, probably did influence him in this for a lot of his time at Paris Saint-Germain. And we all know he spent a lot of his 3 years at the club so far looking to get out. I remember being told last year, actually, that a lot of blame was put on his father initially, but the father actually wanted to stay at Barcelona. And this is one of the kind of there's a whole dynamic, a psychological dynamic here with Neymar, maybe in his relationship with his dad. But I remember being told by someone who worked with him and represented him that it was actually Neymar's decision to go to PSG, and part of it was because he's surrounded by such a massive entourage, where it almost feels like he's often not in control of his own career. So he put the foot down and said, "No, I think I want to do this deal." Then he got there and realised it was very different to Barca, where he obviously had his two big mates in Leo Messi and Luis Suarez. But I mean, things from a football perspective, given, I suppose, the joke that PSG have been in the Champions League, particularly 2017 and 2019 when they suffered another humiliation with United. But under Tuchel, things have come together. It feels like they've found a bit of a chemistry that works, and Neymar being fit has helped. It's helped his kind of mindset as regards the club. And for all the criticisms, it's probably no coincidence that they've suffered all these early eliminations and all these humiliations when he's not been in the team. And when he's finally in the team for the latter stages, they finally make that breakthrough. I mean, he hasn't scored in a few games yet, but he's been brilliant in every single game.
Miguel, I'll give you a prediction. Who's going to win?
I think actually PSG are just going to shade it.
Right.
I think Bayern are susceptible to. I feel Bayern are overall a better team with and it feels like they're more competent in more areas. But I just worry. I think in a one-off game like this, they almost got caught a few times against Barca and Lyon, despite ultimately hammering them. But there was 20-minute spells when they could really got caught, and you feel that pacing behind when you got Mbappe and Neymar. That's where I'd worry for Bayern. That's why I actually just think it'll tip towards PSG.
Yeah, Mbappe and Neymar. Who couldn't love watching Mbappe and Neymar? They know what they're doing, those sports washers. Miguel, great to have you with us. Enjoy the trip. Thanks a million.